I was leaning against the edge of the counter at the little bookstore, absently tapping my fingers against a stack of returned novels, when she disappeared into the back room to answer her phone. The hum of the fluorescent lights and the faint smell of old paper filled the silence. But it wasn't empty. It was heavy with a kind of anticipation I didn't understand yet. Her sister, whom I'd only met once before, was perched on a stool across from me, flipping through a copy of Pride and Prejudice. She looked up, just for a moment, and the words slipped out before either of us could stop them. "Do you ever wonder?" I blinked, unsure how to respond. Wonder about what? The question was soft, teasing, almost a whisper, yet it carried a weight that made my stomach knot. Her eyes held mine with this sharp, curious intensity, as if she already knew there were answers buried somewhere inside me, answers I hadn't even admitted to myself. The older woman returned then, moving through the doorway with a grace that felt effortless, as though she had all the time in the world but somehow knew exactly where every second would land. Her hair caught the light just right, a few stray strands brushing her cheek. She smiled at me, warm, confident, layered. Not flirty, exactly, but charged, in a way that made my pulse spike for reasons I couldn't name. She dropped a stack of books onto the counter with a soft thud and looked at me, tilting her head slightly. "Are you finding everything okay?" she asked. There was nothing remarkable about the words themselves, but the way her fingers lingered on the edges of the books, almost brushing mine, and the tiny crease in her brow as she waited for my answer made it impossible to focus on anything but the warmth of her presence. I nodded, though my throat had gone dry, and for a moment we just stood there. Time felt like it had splintered into fragments. The smell of coffee from the shop next door, the faint rustle of pages as her sister read, the soft click of the phone in the back room. Every small sound seemed amplified, every glance charged. Her sister didn't look back at her book again. She studied me as though she were waiting for me to say something I didn't yet know how to put into words. The corners of her mouth twitched in amusement, and I suddenly realized she wasn't really curious about the book. She was watching me, testing me, or maybe just seeing me. The older woman moved closer to organize the counter, and our hands brushed again, brief and fleeting, but it made something in my chest ache in a way I couldn't ignore. I wanted to say something clever, something casual, something that would mask the way my heart had jumped, but the words failed me entirely. Her sister gave a soft hum, almost like a laugh, and muttered, "Interesting, isn't it?" without taking her eyes off me. I didn't know what was interesting, exactly. The way the light caught her sister's eyes, or the way the older woman's hair smelled faintly of vanilla and soap, or maybe the way my own pulse was suddenly too loud. I watched her return to the back room, phone pressed to her ear, and felt a strange, unshakable pull toward her. My eyes lingered on the doorway long after she disappeared. The air seemed heavier now, and the quiet of the bookstore pressed in close. I couldn't stop thinking about the subtle tilt of her head, the brief, impossible electricity of our shared glance, the way everything in the room seemed to rearrange itself around her presence. And somewhere in the back of my mind, the words her sister had said echoed softly. "Do you ever wonder?" I didn't know what to wonder yet, but I knew I would. The next afternoon, I found myself in the bookstore again, pretending I had errands to run while really waiting for her. She was behind the counter, reorganizing a shelf that looked already perfect to my eyes. I offered to help, mostly because I wanted an excuse to be near her without seeming obvious. She didn't protest, but there was a cautious tilt in her posture, like she was calculating how much of herself to reveal. I handed her a stack of books, noticing the way her hands moved, precise, deliberate, but just a little too fast, like she was trying not to linger where I could see. "You've got quite the system here," I said, trying to keep my voice casual, even though every glance toward her made my chest tighten. She let out a soft laugh, not forced but careful, as if she didn't entirely trust the sound yet. It was warm, but guarded, and I caught the fleeting shadow behind her eyes. Tiredness, maybe, or worry. She shifted her weight and rubbed the back of her neck. A small gesture, barely noticeable, but it made her seem human, fragile in a way I hadn't expected. I didn't say anything, just continued sorting books beside her, quietly observing. The light caught her hair differently now, and I noticed the faint lines at the corners of her eyes, the way she sometimes bit her lip when she was thinking. I wanted to reach out, to brush that strand of hair back or offer some word of comfort, but something in the set of her shoulders told me it wasn't mine to give. At one point, she paused, staring at a book in her hands with a faraway look. I hesitated too, unsure whether to interrupt, and in that silence, the space between us felt charged. I noticed the slight tremor in her fingers, the gentle exhale that seemed to release tension I hadn't realized she was holding. She was trying not to let me see, but small details don't lie. She glanced up, catching my gaze for a fraction of a second. Something flickered there, hesitation, maybe, or a question she didn't voice. She swallowed, straightened, and shook her head slightly, like she had to reset herself. I wanted to reach out, but I didn't. I wanted to ask if she was okay, but I sensed the answer would cost her more than she wanted to give. Instead, I handed her the next stack of books, letting my fingers brush hers ever so briefly. The contact was accidental, but it lingered in a way neither of us could pretend was nothing. She froze for a heartbeat, then nodded, almost imperceptibly, and went back to her work. We moved around each other in quiet rhythm, and the room felt smaller, warmer. The air carried a faint scent of coffee and paper and something else I couldn't name. Her, maybe. Every movement she made, every quiet exhale, seemed amplified, as though the world had shrunk to the space we shared. As I reached for another book, our hands met again, this time intentional, though neither of us spoke. I felt the heat of her skin through the thin fabric of her sleeve, the subtle pressure of her fingers as she held the stack steady. She didn't pull away, but she didn't lean in either. I looked up at her, and in that moment, her eyes softened just slightly, a tiny crack in the careful armor she carried. It wasn't an invitation, not really, but it was something far more potent. Acknowledgement. Recognition that she knew I was here, that I noticed, that I cared. And just like that, the space between us hummed with something forbidden, fragile, and undeniable. A tension neither of us named, but both of us felt, lingering in the quiet shuffle of books and the soft rustle of pages. It was late, almost closing time, and the rain had started tapping against the bookstore windows in uneven rhythms. The street outside shimmered with reflections of neon signs, blurring in the wet glass. She was shelving the last row of books, and I was standing too close, pretending to read a spine, aware that every movement of hers made my chest tighten. "You're still here," she said without looking at me, voice soft, tired. There was a flicker in her eyes, though, like she'd noticed my hesitation, my lingering. I wanted to help," I said, fumbling the words, though I knew neither of us really meant that. My hands were idle at my sides, but my heart felt loud enough to drown out the rain. She paused, letting a book slide from her hand. I caught it instinctively, our fingers brushing, and froze the second it happened. Her eyes lifted, meeting mine, and for a moment the room shrank. The bookstore, the rain, even the street outside, it all disappeared except for the space between us. She started, then stopped, shaking her head. She looked away, lips pressed together, shoulders stiff. That brief hesitation spoke louder than any words could. There was something she wanted to say, something heavy she held back, and the air between us was almost unbearable. I wanted to ask her, to reach closer, to let my voice carry what my heart couldn't. But a sudden buzz from her phone broke the moment, sharp and insistent. She glanced at the screen, a flicker of annoyance passing over her face. I recognized the name, familiar yet unwelcome, her ex. She stepped back instinctively, apologetic, and answered, her tone professional, clipped. I watched her through the glass of the display case, noting the slight tremor in her hands, the way her jaw tightened, the quiet exhale when she realized the call was brief. When she hung up, she didn't return immediately. She leaned against the counter, looking down at the scattered books, as if gathering herself. I wanted to reach across, to say something that might ease whatever she carried, but I didn't. I stayed still, letting the silence stretch, feeling the pull of her presence more acutely than ever. There was a tension that refused to be named, a yearning in the way her shoulders drooped just enough, in the way her hair fell into her eyes. Finally, she looked up. Her gaze met mine, and there was a flicker of unspoken understanding, a secret hovering on the edge of words we would never say. I took a careful step closer, and she didn't move away, though she didn't lean in either. The storm outside intensified, rain lashing the windows with a sudden insistence. The sound was loud enough to mask the quickening of my heartbeat. Our hands hovered over the same book on the counter, just inches apart, and I could feel the warmth radiating from her skin. My breath hitched slightly, and for a moment, everything in me wanted to close the gap. She reached for the book, brushing my fingers lightly, almost by accident. The touch was electric, fleeting, enough to make the world spin just a little. I froze, resisting the pull, aware of the line we weren't meant to cross, aware of the consequences hovering behind her eyes. Then, a sharp knock on the door, the landlord, checking the locks, snapped the moment apart. She stepped back, stiffened, and offered a polite, exhausted smile. The space between us returned to its proper, safe distance, but the air still hummed with what almost happened. I stood there, hand inches from hers, heart pounding, and realized that nothing had changed yet everything had shifted. The storm outside continued, but inside, the electricity lingered, unspoken, unresolved, and impossible to ignore. The bookstore was nearly empty, the late afternoon sun slanting in through the windows in thin, golden lines. Dust motes floated lazily in the light, and the air smelled faintly of old paper and coffee from the shop next door. I leaned against the counter, pretending to check the books, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from her. She moved with quiet deliberation, but her usual composure fell off. The energy between us was different, charged, fragile, and impossible to ignore. She paused mid-shelf, fingers resting on the spine of a book, and let out a soft sigh, the kind that carried everything she wasn't saying. "I don't know what we're doing," she said suddenly, voice low, almost trembling. Her eyes didn't meet mine. They hovered somewhere between the shelf and the floor, lost in thought. I froze, my chest tightening. The words were simple, but they landed like a stone in water, sending ripples I couldn't contain. I started, but the words caught in my throat. She looked up then, and for the first time in weeks, really looked at me. Not just the surface, not just the polite mask we wore in public, but the weight we carried. There was confusion in her eyes, yes, but also a raw honesty I hadn't expected. It made me want to step closer, to bridge the gap, but something inside me held me back. I mean, her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted a stack of books. Sometimes I feel like everything is not right, and I don't know why I can't stop thinking about it. The vulnerability in her voice made my stomach knot. I wanted to reach for her hand, to steady her, to offer some word that might anchor her, but I didn't. I only nodded, letting the silence stretch between us. Silence that spoke louder than anything either of us could have said. I noticed the small details, how her hair fell across her cheek, how her shoulders slumped with quiet exhaustion, how her lips quivered just enough to betray her inner turmoil. Every subtle movement screamed honesty, yet there was restraint, a careful border around the chaos inside her. "I feel like I'm missing something," she whispered, almost to herself. Her voice cracked, and my chest ached in response. She glanced at me briefly, a question in her gaze, a plea I didn't know how to answer. I wanted to say it, everything, all the things I'd kept bottled up, but the right words didn't exist yet. So I stayed quiet, letting her voice fill the room, letting the unspoken pass between us. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. She shifted, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear, eyes darting to the window where the sun had begun to sink lower, painting the room in warmer, heavier tones. Finally, she let out a shuddering breath, stepping back from the counter. Her gaze lingered on mine, searching, questioning, and the tension between us tightened, unyielding. "I don't want to ruin anything," she said, voice breaking, words clipped but honest. And just like that, the fragile barrier holding us apart trembled. She turned, gathering herself, and left the room with a faint, almost imperceptible sigh. I remained at the counter, hands frozen, staring at the space she had just occupied. My heart pounded with the weight of her words, the impossibility of what we were, and the realization that nothing would ever feel normal again. And in that quiet, sun-drenched room, I finally understood the truth she hadn't yet said aloud. We were already too entangled to go back. The rain had stopped, leaving the street outside slick and reflective. The bookstore smelled faintly of damp pages and the last traces of coffee from the cafe down the block. I was straightening a shelf near the back when she came in, carrying a small, worn notebook. She hesitated at the doorway, as if deciding whether to let me see her at all. I found this today," she said, voice low, almost fragile. She set the notebook on the counter between us. Her hands lingered on it, fingers brushing the cover like it carried a memory too heavy to hold alone. I leaned forward, curiosity and something else, an unnameable pull, mixing in my chest. "What is it?" I asked, though I had a feeling I already knew. She swallowed and opened it slowly, revealing pages of handwriting, careful and looping. "It's things I wrote a long time ago," she murmured. "About someone I lost. Someone I shouldn't have loved. Maybe I was too young to understand." Her eyes met mine for a heartbeat, then darted away. She looked smaller somehow, as though the weight of that memory had condensed into the lines of her shoulders. I don't usually talk about it," she said. I haven't really told anyone." I reached for the notebook, careful not to touch her fingers, and glanced at a page. The words were messy but heartfelt, filled with longing, guilt, and the ache of a love that had slipped through her grasp. And for the first time, I saw the cracks behind her composed exterior, the hidden layers of grief she carried with her every day. I didn't know," I whispered. "Not about the past, not fully, but about this side of her, the part she kept guarded, even from herself." She nodded, eyes glistening. "It's silly, maybe, but it shaped me, made me cautious, made me wonder if I'd ever feel something like that again, without losing myself." I hesitated. The words hung in the air, raw and fragile. I wanted to reach for her, to offer some kind of comfort, but I didn't. I only stood there, watching her breathe, noticing the faint tremor in her hands, the way her lips pressed together as if trying to hold in something she wasn't ready to release. I lost him when I wasn't ready," she said softly, voice almost breaking, "and I thought I'd never forgive myself." The ache in her words landed in my chest. I wanted to tell her it wasn't her fault, that she deserved more than guilt, but the truth was, I didn't know how to make it better. All I could do was stay close and notice. She closed the notebook with a quiet thud, brushing the corners with her fingers. I could see her chest rising and falling in uneven rhythms, the silent shiver of someone who had carried this weight alone for too long. I offered a small, hesitant smile. She returned it, fragile but real, and for a moment, the tension between us softened, just slightly. Then she reached out, ever so subtly, brushing her fingers against mine as she picked up the notebook. The contact was brief, almost accidental, but it sent a quiet tremor through me, something seismic in its softness. We stood there, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from her, far enough apart that nothing crossed the line. And in that small, almost imperceptible moment, I realized something had shifted, something inside her, inside me, something that neither of us could unsee or undo. The rain outside glimmered off the windows, and I knew that the world had tilted just a little. The bookstore was nearly empty again, the afternoon sunlight soft and warm through the tall windows. Dust motes floated lazily, and the faint scent of old paper wrapped around us like a quiet cloak. We had been working side by side, sorting returns, moving books from one shelf to another, but it felt different now. Heavier, slower, meaningful. She paused at the counter, her hands resting lightly on a stack of novels. I noticed the way her fingers lingered, the subtle tension in her shoulders finally relaxing. She glanced at me, and for a fraction of a second, her eyes were unguarded, warm, and entirely honest. I don't want to pretend anymore," she said quietly. No dramatic confession, no flourish, just a simple acknowledgement of the truth we had both been skirting around for weeks. I nodded slowly, feeling something in my chest ease and tighten all at once. Neither do I admitted, letting the words settle into the space between us. We returned to our tasks in silence, but it wasn't awkward, it was intimate. Each movement was noticed. The way her hair fell over her cheek, the soft brushing of her sleeve against my arm, the way her breath caught ever so slightly when our hands passed over the same book. Small, accidental touches that carried weight because they were real. At one point, I set a book down and looked up. She was watching me, not with scrutiny or caution, but with quiet understanding. No words were needed. The room hummed with what we had both realized, that we were drawn together, that the line between us had shifted irreversibly. I moved a little closer, careful, deliberate. She didn't flinch. Her hand hovered near mine for a moment before brushing against it ever so lightly. An acknowledgement, a seal, without saying a single word. The contact was brief, almost imperceptible, but it made my chest swell in a way that made everything else fade. We stood there, side by side, letting the silence speak for us. There was no rush, no need to define what this meant. Only the shared space and the quiet recognition of what had grown between us. It felt inevitable, earned, not a fairy tale, not a sudden spark, but the accumulation of small moments, long conversations, accidental touches, and lingering glances. I noticed the way her eyes softened as she caught mine, a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing at the corners of her lips. I wanted to speak, to say something clever or profound, but it didn't feel necessary. The acknowledgement was enough. Finally, we sat down on the low bench near the window, still sorting books but side by side, shoulders just barely touching. Her hand brushed mine again, this time resting there a little longer, and I let my fingers curl lightly around hers. Neither of us moved, neither of us spoke. The sunlight shifted, and the dust motes danced lazily in the golden light. Outside, the world continued, indifferent, but in this small corner of quiet and paper, everything felt aligned. We didn't need words. We didn't need declarations. The pull between us had been recognized, honored, and accepted, quietly, gently, and irrevocably. And in that shared, unspoken understanding, I felt a calm settle over us, a finality that wasn't an ending. It was a beginning that didn't need to be named. Looking back, it's hard to pinpoint the exact moment when everything shifted between us. It wasn't a grand declaration or a sudden event. It was a collection of small things, almost imperceptible at the time. A brush of hands, a shared laugh, the quiet understanding that silence could carry as much weight as words. I've spent a lot of time replaying those afternoons in the bookstore. The way she moved, so confident and layered, yet quietly fragile. The way I noticed, sometimes too much, sometimes not enough. I remember the tension, the near confessions, the pauses that spoke louder than any sentence ever could. And now, with the distance of hindsight, I see how much we were both learning, not about each other, exactly, but about ourselves. She changed, in ways subtle but profound. She allowed herself to trust again, to be seen without the carefully constructed walls she'd held around her heart for years. She became gentler with herself, less burdened by the past, more willing to let the quiet, human moments matter. I could see it in the tilt of her head, the ease of her smile, the way she let me linger in her presence without pulling away. And I changed too. I learned patience, the weight of restraint, the slow, careful cultivation of something that wasn't ours to demand. I learned to notice, to hold space, to care without overstepping, to treasure fleeting moments as if they were whole universes. Love, I realized, doesn't always arrive in fireworks or declarations. Sometimes it unfolds quietly, in the spaces between words, in gestures that seem too small to notice but carry the gravity of everything. It's in the shared silences, the tentative touches, the acknowledgement that connection can exist without a name, without a timeline, without certainty. We never rushed it. We never forced it. And maybe that's why it became something we didn't need to define, something that could be quietly, inevitably ours. There was no fantasy perfection, no fairy tale ending. Just the reality of two people who had found something rare, fragile, and entirely human. Now, when I walk past that street, past that little bookstore, I smile softly at the memory. I feel the pull of what we built together, a connection that changed how I see the world, how I see love, how I see myself. It wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic revelations. It was about noticing, being present, and allowing something beautiful to grow in plain sight. And sometimes, late at night, when everything else is quiet, I catch myself smiling at the thought of her, the way she looked at me, the way she allowed herself to be seen, and I realize that some moments, some people, leave a mark you don't outgrow. If this story made you feel something, let me know in the comments. Would you want more stories like this?